Road to Hell, the battle for Guam. The first thing I remember is the smell, hot, thick, and salty, like the ocean had mixed with a burning metal of war. It clung to my skin, settled in my throat, and refused to let go. The landing craft rocked violently, salt spray mixing with sweat and fear, while the distant rumble of naval bombardment rolled across the waves like the voice of some ancient god. Guam lay ahead, a dark shape against the morning sky, its beaches already clawed by smoke and fire. I gripped my Browning M1919, knuckles white. The metal was warm from my hands, its weight familiar yet terrifying. I had trained for this, imagined it 1,000 times, but nothing could prepare me for the reality of war. The shouts of the sergeant barely registered, drowned out by the crash of artillery and the wild hammering of my own heart. The ramp dropped. Hell opened. We hit the water, churning through the surf as bullets shredded the air. Men went down before they even reached the beach, their bodies swallowed by the tide, faces vanishing beneath the foam. I ran because stopping meant dying. My boots found sand, and I threw myself forward, digging into the earth like it could shield me. The air screamed. Mortars ripped into the beach, sending plumes of fire and blood skyward. A man next to me, Jackson, I think, jerked back, his helmet flying off, a crimson mist where his face had been. I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. We had been told the Japanese were dug in, but no briefing could have painted the picture in front of me. Machine guns chattered from hidden bunkers, their rounds cutting through our ranks like wheat in a side's path. The jungle beyond the beach was alive with movement, shadows shifting among the trees, waiting for us to come closer. I hit the ground behind a half-buried log, panting, my hands trembling as I loaded a new belt into the Browning. Sand caked my lips. My uniform clung to me like a second skin soaked in fear. Sergeant O'Malley dropped beside me, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, eyes sharp as broken glass. "Blake, get that damn gun up." I didn't hesitate. The world shrank to the trigger at the sights, the pounding recoil as I let loose. The Browning roared, a beast in my hands, spitting fire toward the bunkers ahead. The jungle spat back, rounds snapping past my head, slamming into the log with bone-jarring force. Someone screamed behind me, a long raw sound that had no words, only agony. And then, just when I thought we had no chance, the world erupted. The Navy had shifted fire inland, and suddenly the bunkers were bathed in explosions, concrete shattering, bodies flying. The air was thick with burning flesh and gunpowder. The Japanese weren't running, though. They were waiting. We pushed forward, inch by inch, every step a battle. The sand, once golden, was now a butcher's floor. The dead lay in grotesque angles, faces frozen in surprise and horror. Some of them were ours. Some of them were not. The jungle loomed ahead, dark and watchful. The beach was behind us, but the battle had only just begun. The jungle swallowed us whole, a suffocating mass of tangled roots, thick undergrowth, and shadows that moved even when the wind was still. The heat was unbearable, thick as syrup, pressing down on my chest with every breath, and the smell of rot, damp earth, and something metallic, something wrong, curled in my nostrils and refused to let go. My uniform was soaked through, the weight of sweat, mud, and blood pulling at me, but there was no time to stop, no time to think. The enemy was out there, waiting, and every step forward felt like pushing into the mouth of something ancient and hungry. The jungle had its own kind of silence, a stillness that wasn't really still, where every distant rustle, every snapped twig, every breath that wasn't yours sent a pulse of cold dread down your spine. We moved in a staggered line, rifles raised, scanning the undergrowth, the twisted branches, the dark hollows beneath the ferns, knowing that the moment we let our guard down, the jungle would come alive with gunfire. I kept my hands tight on the Browning, my fingers slick on the grip, feeling the weight of it like an anchor to something real, something solid, because everything else, the trees, the vines, the bodies we left behind on the beach, felt like a fever dream, something out of a place where time and reality had twisted into something unrecognizable. The first shot came from nowhere, a single crack that shattered the damp air, and then all hell broke loose. Bullets ripped through the leaves, splintered tree trunks, sent bark and dirt spraying in all directions, and men dove for cover, shouting warnings, barking orders, trying to find where the fire was coming from. But the jungle was a liar, a shifting, living thing that turned sound and movement against us. I swung the Browning up, eyes scanning for a target, any target, but all I saw were shapes, moving, crouching, shifting, and before I could fire, the man to my left, Henderson from Kansas, a farm boy with a lazy grin and a lucky rabbit's foot. let out a sharp, choked sound and crumpled forward, his hands clawing at the gaping wound in his throat. There was no time to think. No time to grieve. I squeezed the trigger, and the Browning roared to life, its deep, gut-shaking thump drowning out everything else. The jungle screamed back, flashes of light stabbing through the green, bodies darting between the trees, and the ground beneath me became a churning mass of mud, sweat, and spent shells. Someone, O'Malley maybe, was shouting, but the words were lost in the madness, and all I could do was keep firing, keep pushing forward, because stopping meant dying, and I wasn't ready for that. The air was thick with smoke and gunpowder, the acrid taste of it coating my tongue, and somewhere in the chaos, I realized that the Japanese weren't retreating. They weren't falling back to regroup. They were waiting, holding their ground, forcing us deeper, pulling us into something we didn't understand. And by the time the realization hit me, it was already too late. The explosion came from below, a sudden, gut-wrenching blast that sent me flying backward, the world tilting, spinning, turning inside out. The jungle blurred into a smear of green and red, and then the ground hit me hard, unforgiving, knocking the breath from my lungs. My ears rang, a high, piercing whine that drowned out everything else, and when I tried to move, pain lanced through my side, sharp and bright, a burning thing that turned the edges of my vision black. Somewhere nearby, men were screaming. Not all of them were ours. The jungle was alive again, moving, shifting, as the enemy closed in, and as I struggled to push myself up, fingers digging into the wet, blood-soaked earth, I realized that I had lost my weapon, that my hands were empty, that the only thing between me and whatever was coming was nothing but the pounding of my own heart. The pain in my side was a living thing, coiling through my ribs, sinking its teeth deep, but there was no time to think about it. My hands clawed at the mud, trying to find something solid, anything to grip onto, but all I felt was the wet heat of blood, mine, someone else's, I couldn't tell. My fingers brushed against something metal, slick with grime and sweat, and I closed around it before my brain had even registered what it was. Not my Browning. A rifle. Someone's rifle. It didn't matter whose. The jungle was still screaming, but the sound had changed. Less gunfire, more voices, more movement, and a terrible low groaning that sent a chill up my spine. I forced myself up, every muscle protesting, the rifle clutched against my chest like a lifeline, my breath coming fast and sharp. Shapes moved through the trees, darting between the shadows, and I felt that sickening, bone-deep certainty that we had walked straight into something meant to kill us all. I turned my head and saw O'Malley, crouched low behind the remains of a tree stump, his face streaked with blood, his eyes wide and searching. His mouth moved, but I couldn't hear him, my ears still filled with a high-pitched ringing, a sound that made everything feel unreal, distant, like I was watching it all through someone else's eyes. Then he was moving, crawling toward me, one hand clamped over a wound in his leg, his other dragging his Thompson through the mud. I reached out, grabbed his arm, pulled him closer. The second his face was near mine, I could finally make out his voice, rough and ragged. "They're everywhere," he rasped, his breath hot against my cheek, his fingers digging into my sleeve. "They knew we were coming. Of course they did. Of course. We had stormed this island thinking we could take it, thinking our firepower and our numbers would be enough, but the Japanese had been here for years. They had dug in, built tunnels, laid traps, turned this jungle into a goddamn killing ground. And now we were bleeding into it, one by one, swallowed whole by a war that didn't care about our plans." A sharp snap to my left made me whip my head around, the rifle coming up instinctively. Something moved fast, low to the ground, barely more than a blur, and then there was a face, dark and smeared with dirt, eyes burning with something I couldn't name. A bayonet glinted in the filtered sunlight, a blade streaked with red. Mine? O'Malley's? Henderson's? I fired. The shot cracked through the humid air, and the figure jerked, crumpling into the undergrowth with a wet, choking sound. I didn't look. I couldn't. My hands were already moving, my body reacting on some primal instinct that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with survival. O'Malley was panting beside me, his grip on my arm tightening. "We gotta move," he said, his voice hoarse, thick with something that might have been fear, but was too exhausted to be anything but determination. "We stay here, we're dead." He was right. But where the hell were we supposed to go? The jungle was closing in, the gunfire thinning, and that was worse, so much worse, because it meant one of two things. Either we were winning, or there weren't enough of us left to keep fighting. I helped O'Malley to his feet, his weight heavy against me, and we stumbled forward, deeper into the green maze, away from the beach, away from what little safety we had left. Behind us, The jungle swallowed the bodies, the blood, the echoes of dying men. Ahead, there was only more of the same. The jungle was alive with whispers, branches shifting, leaves rustling, footsteps that weren't ours, weren't human, just the weight of war pressing down on the earth, sinking into the roots. My breath was ragged, my side burning with every movement, but stopping wasn't an option. O'Malley leaned heavy against me, his leg dragging, his breath coming in sharp, pained gasps. Every step forward felt like pushing against something unseen, something waiting. We didn't talk. Talking would have meant facing the truth, that we were alone out here, cut off, surrounded, nothing more than two ghosts wandering through a graveyard that hadn't realized it was a graveyard yet. The gunfire had faded into the distance, just the occasional crack of a rifle, the distant boom of an explosion, like the jungle itself was breathing, exhaling violence into the damp air. O'Malley was slipping, his strength bleeding out through his leg, and I had to tighten my grip around his shoulder just to keep him upright. Every few yards, we had to stop, crouching low behind the thick trunks of ancient trees, listening, waiting. The enemy was out there. They had to be. The jungle felt too still, too expectant, like it was watching us, holding its breath. Then I heard it. Not gunfire. Not shouting. Something else. A voice. Not English. Soft, murmuring, not urgent, not afraid. The sound of men talking like they were sitting around a fire, like this wasn't war, like they were just waiting. I froze, my fingers tightening on the rifle. O'Malley stiffened beside me, his body tensing like a coiled wire, and I felt his breath hitch in his chest. Slowly, carefully, we moved, inching forward through the undergrowth, the leaves brushing against us, the damp earth swallowing our footsteps. The jungle thinned just slightly, enough to see the faint glow of a lantern, the flicker of movement. Clearing, small, almost hidden. 5 of them, maybe 6. Japanese soldiers, sitting, crouching, their rifles resting against the trunks of trees, their faces calm, relaxed. Not like men in the middle of a battle. Like men who had already won. One of them laughed at a low, quiet sound, and the others smiled, nodding. A canteen was passed around. One of them lit a cigarette. I could smell the smoke sharp against the thick, rotting sweetness of the jungle. They weren't nervous. They weren't watching the trees, weren't gripping their weapons like they expected a fight, because they knew something we didn't. O'Malley shifted beside me, and I felt the slow, deliberate movement of his hand reaching for his Thompson. No. I grabbed his wrist, squeezed hard. His eyes snapped to mine, confused, angry, desperate. But I knew. I didn't know how, but I knew. This wasn't a fight we could win. I shook my head, just once, barely a movement, but enough. His jaw clenched, his breath flaring through his nose, but he didn't argue. We moved back, inch by inch, slow as death. And then the jungle betrayed us. A branch, dry despite the humidity, cracked beneath my boot, a sharp, brittle sound that split the air, shattered the stillness, turned the quiet into something electric. The voices in the clearing stopped. Silence. A long, terrible silence. Then movement. Fast, sharp, shadows shifting. And then the shouting started. I didn't think. Didn't breathe. Just grabbed O'Malley and ran. Branches whipped against my face. Vines clutched at my arms. The ground slick and treacherous beneath my boots. Behind us, voices barked commands. Boots slammed against the earth. Gunfire erupted, short, sharp bursts, bullets slicing through the leaves, snapping against the trees. Something hot grazed my shoulder. O'Malley stumbled. I yanked him forward, my muscles screaming, my lungs burning, the jungle spinning into a blur of green and darkness and the flashes of muzzle fire behind us. A root caught my foot. I went down hard, O'Malley tumbling with me, the impact slamming the air from my lungs, pain exploding through my side, through my ribs, through every part of me. And then, nothing. Just darkness. And the quiet hum of the jungle, waiting. The darkness wasn't complete. Somewhere far away, beyond the thick veil of pain and exhaustion, I could hear the jungle breathing, leaves rustling, insects humming, the distant, steady rhythm of the ocean, whispering like something ancient, something that had seen all of this before. I wasn't dead, yet. I forced my eyes open, the world tilting, blurring. The jungle stretched above me, thick and endless, a tangled mess of branches and shadows. The sky just a sliver of pale light filtering through the canopy. My body felt heavy, like I had sunk into the earth itself, swallowed by the mud and the blood and the weight of what had happened. Then I remembered O'Malley. I turned my head, panic clawing at my throat, and there he was, just a few feet away, half propped against a tree, his chest rising and falling in sharp, shallow breaths. His face was pale, too pale, sweat shining on his skin, his fingers still gripping his Thompson, like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. His leg, Jesus, his leg. Blood soaked through the fabric, dark and spreading. He was alive, but not for long. And then I heard them. Footsteps, slow, measured, close. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Shadows shifted between the trees, dark shapes moving in silence, rifles raised, eyes scanning the undergrowth. They weren't running anymore. They didn't need to. They knew we were down. They knew this jungle better than we ever could. They had already won. A voice low, firm, speaking Japanese, cut through the stillness. Another responded, softer, almost casual. And then they were spreading out, sweeping the area, their boots pressing into the mud, their fingers resting on their triggers. I tightened my grip on the rifle. O'Malley met my gaze, his eyes dark, knowing. There's no getting out of this. No backup coming. No miracle. Just two men, lost in the jungle, surrounded, bleeding, at the end of the road. O'Malley exhaled, slow and steady, and in that moment I saw it in his face, the decision. The acceptance. I shook my head, barely a movement, but he just smiled, a tired, lopsided thing, the kind of smile you give when you already know how the story ends. His fingers flexed around the Thompson. No, I wanted to say it. Wanted to reach out, stop him, hold him back just one more second. But the second was already gone. O'Malley moved first. The Thompson roared to life, a burst of fire cutting through the silence, ripping into the jungle, sending the enemy scattering. The muzzle flash lit up his face, determined, unafraid, already somewhere else. And then the return fire came. Loud, violent, unforgiving. O'Malley jerked once, twice, his body slamming back against the tree, his mouth opening in a sound I couldn't hear, his hands slipping from the Thompson as the jungle swallowed him whole. I didn't think, didn't feel, just moved. The rifle came up. My fingers squeezed the trigger, and the world exploded into chaos. Shouting, gunfire, shadows lunging forward. The jungle spinning, twisting, the air thick with smoke and blood. I fired again, and again, my mind blank, my body nothing more than instinct and desperation. A sharp pain tore through my shoulder. My grip faltered. Another impact, lower, near my ribs. My knees buckled. The jungle tilted. I hit the ground. The last thing I saw was the sky. Just a sliver, just a whisper of blue through the endless green. Then nothing. They say war is hell. But hell isn't fire and brimstone. It isn't devils with pitchforks or lakes of lava. Hell is a jungle that never stops whispering. Hell is the sound of the ocean, rolling in, rolling out, carrying away the echoes of dying men. Hell is knowing that somewhere, far away, the world keeps turning, the sun keeps rising, and none of this will ever matter to anyone but the men who lived it, and the men who didn't. The Battle of Guam raged for weeks. We took the island. We planted the flag. We called it a victory. But some roads, once walked, never really end. And some men, once lost, never really leave. I know, because I still hear the jungle whisper. I still hear O'Malley laughing somewhere just out of reach. And I know deep in my bones that part of me never left that island. Maybe I never will.